Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CFO Lunchtime Live. My name is James Solomons, Global CFO at Xrep, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's live CFO Roundtable event in partnership with SAP Concur, a valued supporter of the series. It is great to have them with us today as we cover off on another topic in our Future of Finance series, which today is exploring how finance can help prevent and detect fraud risk. Now, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and New Zealand and recognise their unique cultural and spiritual relationships to the land, waters and seas, and their rich contribution to society. We pay our respects to ancestors and elders past, present and emerging. Now, COVID has accelerated the transformation agenda, and it's a topic we have talked about many times on the CFO series Lunchtime Lives. However, many organisations are still reliant upon paper-based processes and spreadsheets to stay on top of their often dated and complex supplier invoice and expense admin, leaving them quite susceptible to fraud. Now, criminals, as we've explored on a few other Lunchtime Lives, are forever coming up with new and inventive ways to scam organisations. And it is the job of the finance team to really detect and protect their organisations from both internal and external threats. So today we are going to be discussing with our panel the biggest current and future threats facing finance teams, such as accounts payable fraud, fraudulent invoices, expense fraud, including fake claims, multiple submissions, overstatements, as well as ensuring that you have clear internal policies in place and robust processes in place to mitigate the risks. Now, this is definitely some of the stuff we're going to be talking about. And of course, these events are always live, and we encourage you to ask questions as we go along. Simply type into the chat box and we will endeavour to answer along the way. And we often have time at the end for any of those questions we can't get to. But it is enough from me. It's time, to hear from our experts. Today, we are going to be joined by Andy Ray, Regional Director, SMB ANZ at SAP Concur, Cormac Denton, Finance Director at PAE NZ Limited, and joining us shortly will be Mark Pesce, futurist and close friend of the CFO series. Andy and Cormac, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's get straight into it. As I said, Mark will be joining us soon, everyone, so you'll see him pop up and we'll say hello when he joins us. But Andy, first question for you. I'm sure everyone here today is familiar with SAP, but could you share with us a little more about SAP Concur and how you work with CFOs and finance teams?
Yeah, absolutely. So I represent a very specific part of SAP, being Concur Technologies. And what we do, I might start by explaining what we do and then how that sort of dovetails and how it helps CFOs and business leaders today. But essentially what we do is pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. We help businesses automate the travel, the expense, and the accounts payable process. The reason we focus on those three areas is if you think about any business, irrespective of its size or where its location is, most employees across the business are empowered to spend in three areas. They're either empowered to travel, they're empowered to incur expenses, and they can incur expenses in multiple of ways. They can pay for those expenses, via their own money, their own credit card, a company credit card, even a purchasing card. And the third area they're empowered to spend the company's money is through the requisition of goods and services, right? So the challenge that a lot of businesses have today is you'd be surprised at how many businesses still have completely manual processes for all of them. If you're lucky, some businesses are what we would call semi-automated. And semi-automated, it just means that they've got some form of workflow in place. They've got some level of automation around it. The problem with manual and semi-automated processes is, well, there's quite a lot of problems with them, to be honest, but I'm going to stay in the realm of fraud and compliance issues, is there's multiple points of failure for fraud. So you don't know when you have disparate systems and you have a travel process here, an expense process here and an invoice process here, all going through either a paper process or even disparate systems, you don't really know that somebody isn't potentially trying to defraud you in one or both of those areas. So that creates a real challenge for business leaders. So that kind of dovetails into the value we bring. The value we bring is that when a business consolidates those processes into a single spend platform, what you get is real-time actionable insight. You get real-time data every time an expense is incurred, every time a trip is booked or requested, every time an invoice comes into the system, whether it's been processed or not. It's in a system and can be reported on. So if you were to think about kind of a really good example of the value that sort of process has provided CFOs in the last 18 months is COVID. Not to bring up the dreaded word, but all of a sudden we were living a normal life, and then we're not. We're all at home, right? Businesses all of a sudden went, hang on a minute, stop spending. We don't know what's going on. When you don't have that information in a central place that is easy to access, you've got to pump data out of multiple systems, sit down like a forensic accountant, and cross your fingers and hope that you get it right. So if I had to summarize the value we bring to CFOs and to business leaders is giving them real-time information so they can make real-time business decisions. And the byproduct being we deliver a really good user experience, because if you give a good user experience, you get high quality data. You give a bad user experience, you're going to get very bad data.
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical to make it easy for the users to be on board. Now, just staying with you, Andy, it's been a roller coaster 18 months for CFOs. Certainly, Cormac would attest to that, along as do I. But I mean, how has that fraud landscape changed in light of working from home? And what have been some of the, I guess, the biggest challenges facing CFOs that you've been hearing?
Yeah, good question. I'm sure they've faced a myriad of challenges I'm not aware of, but in the realm of keeping it around fraud, I think the biggest challenge would be that the vast majority of businesses weren't prepared to just suddenly work from home and be remote. I work for a tech company, so we've had a remote environment for quite some time, but I was genuinely shocked at how many businesses just weren't prepared to have go from a centralized workforce to a completely decentralized workforce. And we saw very early on in the pandemic that people came to us and said, the problem is we're still flowing paper around a business. We have no idea where the paper is, and we've sent all of our administrative staff home. No one can walk in and drop a piece of paper on their desk anymore, right? We don't even know what our liabilities are right now. So that creates a huge problem, and it also creates a huge point of failure for the business, where opportunistic people, both internally to the company, unfortunately, and externally to them, can take advantage of that. And unfortunately, we did see people do that. We saw people bend the new rules and the new norm to their own financial benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great introduction to a lot of what we're going to talk about today. Before we get to you, Cormac, Mark, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I apologize that I was a little late. I had some technical difficulties, which were only half solved. So therefore, you can see a green screen and not a magical background behind me. I apologize for that.
That's all right, Mark. We're here to hear your wonderful insights, but I'll be come back to you in a sec. Cormac, it's great to have you join us again today. Thanks for joining us again. Now, you are Finance Director at PAE, one of the largest facilities management companies in NZ. And prior to this, you were the CFO at Kapura, one of New Zealand's largest bar and hospitality groups. Now, look, please feel free to give us a short intro to yourself in a second, and then answer these questions for us. I mean, given CFOs have been pulled in multiple directions and juggling many different balls, especially in the last 18 months, how high a priority do you think fraud has been for CFOs? And do you think that sometimes it's pushed into the this won't happen to us category, or it's an IT security issue? You know, where do you think this is sitting? And do you think there's a way or a need for this to be a mindset change?
Yeah, really interesting, James. So let's start with the mindset change and what's happening first. So all too often people think about fraud and they think about it's somebody else's issue, it's somebody else's problem, it's never going to happen to me. So I sort of wanted to kick off today by talking about two stories of fraud that have happened to me. So the first one was when I was a group controller over in Europe and had a whole lot of different FDs or CFOs reporting in through to me. And so we were based in London at the time. Early in the morning, our French FD got a call, and somebody impersonating me, telling them to drop money into their bank account. And so it went from Russia to Czech Republic to Romania and started all the way across Europe. And so really, really quickly, before I'd even gotten up, we had an action plan that had got in place. And so what was interesting is these people were impersonating me, and there was only one thing that really caught them out. So the Russian FD, first thing in the morning, jumped on the call to this person impersonating me who was furious and wanted money right now, and you know, really using that command and control structure. And so this person who was impersonating me had this brilliant accent from the UK. I think it was from the Cotswolds or something like that. So what they didn't realise is that I was from New Zealand, had a freakishly different accent, and I had contacted my FDs pretty consistently. And so we had some processes in place where if anything like this happens, because we're a large international company, let everyone know. So they managed to only get through 3 countries before the rest of Europe and the world knew. And we turned that off pretty quickly. So it was freaky because people were impersonating me. And all too often you think, geez, maybe that's an issue with me. That's probably a different case that won't crop up every day. But here's one which probably will. So this happened about 2 months ago in my current role. And what happened is somebody had backdoored into our email system. So anyone here who uses Google Chrome, you're at risk. So Google Chrome has the ability to save all of your passwords, and included in that, it saved my work email address because I didn't want to type in every single day my work email address. What they managed to do is you've got, without getting into the technology side, you've got a backdoor into Outlook Express, and that allows you to jump onto a website and effectively run your emails as though you would off say, your phone or something like that. So these people had been watching my email address for at least a week. They sent an invoice from my email address to the person who normally makes payments. And so it looked relatively legitimate. It had a New Zealand bank account. It looked like it could have been for either legal or M&A services, you know, that sort of stuff that you don't really want everyone to know about. So you keep it a little bit quiet and you go, hey, look, can you just pay this? And so we caught that within about a minute. And so how we caught that was, again, our processes. And so our processes were that I would digitally sign off through a particular mechanism, invoices, and they wouldn't come through that normal porthole. So these people had only been watching my email address for about a week, and I hadn't really followed due process as I should have, so I'd signed off some of our contractor invoices and sent them through. But the emails were brilliant. They said things like hi team, they said things like cheers, they said all those sort of terminologies that I would normally use in an email. So again, for me, that's reiterating the point for absolutely anyone on this call, it will happen to you. I have been hit by fraud so many times in the last 10 years, it's not funny. And I know that a lot of my colleagues are the same. So the one tip or trick I've got for everyone is really about, and we'll probably cover this more as we go through today, it's really about culture. So the only reason I caught that last email was our culture. So our culture gave our AP person the ability to come up to me and challenge me and say, is this correct? If you're working in an organization right now that you're not comfortable that your AP person would come up to you, or you don't have technology platforms to challenge it, then that fraud's just going to go through, and actually no one will know. It will just carry on through and it'll get paid, and it won't be until years later or much time later that you're looking at a particular supplier and you're going, how the hell are we paying these guys, you know, 100K, 200K, and then you realize the cat's out of the bag months later. So that's a key message from me, James, is it happens to anyone.
Yeah, definitely. It's I mean, there were so many right then and there, and in those 2 examples you provided, there were so many action points. We could probably stop right now and finish, but certainly we've got a lot to get through. So thanks for, again, you know, like Andy, a great start. Now, Mark, as a good friend of the CFO series, many of our attendees already know that you're a futurist speaker, inventor, multiple award-winning author and podcaster. And like previous Lunchtime Live webcasts, you're going to provide us with a closing wrap at the end of today. but I must say I'm looking forward to asking you a few questions in your capacity as a panel member today.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for your time to be on for the full hour. Now, the first question though, technology has been the savior of COVID. It's allowed us to pivot, remain connected, work remotely, accelerate the digital economy and change behaviors. But has it left us more open to fraud? And generally speaking, why is fraud on the rise?
So I think it's really good if I just kind of pick up where Cormac left off, because he talked about building a culture where people were free to be able to go to him when they had questions. That culture has often been centered around being in an office or being in close connectivity with people, being able to walk over to someone. Yes, sometimes it's picking up the phone. And part of what we're seeing now is, particularly for organizations who never really had to do a massive work from home or work from anywhere effort, is that the policies that were very good at protecting them before now need to be rethought. And some of this is basic IT. Most of the IT security infrastructure has always been inward facing, that we put a ring around the business, that business is physically located, therefore the ring is physically located. Now employee machines are everywhere, data is going in everywhere. It's probably, hopefully, going in over a VPN. But again, as Cormac points out, if you're using the wrong browser in the wrong way, that information can be leaking out in all sorts of different ways. So what work from home has done is, yes, it's enabled us to work from anywhere, but it has also radically increased the threat surface. And if we're talking about social hacks, and social hacks are the most common type of hack, it's not generally a technological hack, it's a social hack, it's a fraud hack, then what we've done is we've increased the number of touch points through which someone can get in so that they can get inside the head of an organization. So every organization now, and particularly, of course, every organization on the east coast of Australia right now, has to be very carefully assessing its work from home, not so much the policies, but the procedures and how we take the practices that were already in place before COVID and now update those so that they make sense in this new framework.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it's definitely that the policies are good, as Cormac said, and you've touched on there. It's you just can't go and talk to somebody over the desk, and that's really my next question for you. Are we trusting technology too much? Are we losing that human connection and just that simple ability to call over to a colleague over a desk or over a partition to question that something doesn't feel right?
And so now I have a story for you. This one happened to me about a fortnight ago. So I got a call from a person, actually it's an email, just out of the blue, apropos of nothing. I got an email out of the blue from someone purporting to be the CFO of a company that I advised. Now, I had not met this person, in part because they were hired during the pandemic when this company was growing rapidly and staffing up. So I actually don't know this person from Adam. And this person is now requesting a whole bunch of very important financial details for an ASIC filing, which makes sense because I'm on the share register. All right. So all of that so far reads correctly. And then I go, wait, I'm going to put this in an email and send this to you? No, because emails are basically clear text. So the answer to that was, I wrote her back and I said, hi, you don't know me. I don't know you. I am not comfortable putting this information into an email. Let's figure out a secure channel so that I can know that you are who you are before I hand over this information. To her credit, she immediately got what I was trying to do. She said, look, I'll have the CEO call you because I'm friends with the CEO, right? And he can get the information from you and then he can give it to me. And of course, when the CEO called, of course, his name came up on my phone because his number is in my phone. So there's that additional assurance that this is the person I'm talking to. I know his voice. He wrote down the information. I said, you're not going to email that to the CFO, are you? Right? Because again, this is our automatic reaction, is these are the processes we've always used. Well, we can't do that. I said, okay, I either call her directly or send her a text message, something that we know is going to be secure for that information, because we actually have to be secure at every step along the way. So when we talk about trusting technology, really it's around trusting our own behaviors around technology and knowing when it's right to seek authentication. A lot of our systems now have two-factor authentication. Well, factoring in the authentication of a person is really almost the best assurance we can have.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely the case in and we're going to talk about this a bit later about that identity verification process. So we're 20 minutes in, guys, and as I said, we could probably stop now. The amount of go-to action points that we've already discovered in our intro is great, and we've got about another half an hour to really dive into some. So let's get into it. So Andy, let's break down the main two types of fraud. We've got internal and external, and so let's start with internal fraud. What do you see as the three most common internal frauds currently, and what do they typically involve, and what are the warning signs that CFOs really need to look for?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give some background, internal fraud obviously is fraud that's origin comes from within your own organization. External fraud is fraud that comes externally to you, similar to what Mark was talking about, people trying to penetrate you through what is often very sophisticated scams, but usually very high volume. Hopefully your internal fraud is lower volume than the external scams, but there's no guarantee of that. Internal fraud, I'll break it down into two parts, if that's all right. We'll talk about what some of the most common types are, and then we'll talk through sort of what CFOs can do, because internal fraud is very challenging, certainly. In my opinion, maybe the more challenging to combat. But the most common that we see is typically just what I would call expense report padding. And expense report padding is essentially just somebody claiming something is a business expense that is not a business expense, but they will be reimbursed for it. And I've got 1,000 stories I could tell you, but I'll stick to a really quick one. It was when I was very young. I was very new to the workforce in my early 20s. I didn't even know what was happening, but I worked under a guy who was my mentor, who we would go to Melbourne. He would hire a car, he would park the car in the hotel, and then we'd walk to our meetings. Nothing strange about that. But there would be times where he'd pop into car parks in different locations while I was getting a coffee or buying him some lunch or something like that. And one time I was with him and he just picked up a bit of a receipt from the car park, and I didn't think anything of it. I thought, hey, guys, lost a receipt and trying to prove that he can get his money back. Very long story short, he had worked out that if he parked at a hotel, you pay a daily rate. You can take your car in and out. They don't charge you. And he could wander around car parks finding receipts that people had left that roughly corresponded to where he was and what he was doing, and claimed that he'd taken the car from the hotel and driven and parked, and they were legitimate expenses. Now, for those of us in Sydney and Melbourne, well, probably Australia-wide, how expensive parking can be. It's absolutely not cheap in the CBD. So it turns out he was essentially just really claiming about 50 to 100 bucks additional each expense report he put through for parking that he never incurred. Doesn't sound like a lot until you factor out how long someone can do that for. So that's an example of internal fraud, where someone just pads out the expense report. One of the other most common is mileage. A lot of businesses will allow their employees to use their own car, and they'll just ask them to account for that mileage based on the ATO rates, and then they'll reimburse them accordingly. You can't prove that I didn't go to my meeting in Alexandria via Manly. Maybe there was a bushfire somewhere. I don't know, right? It becomes very challenging. So mileage is a really big area where people tend to pad it out. In fact, there's some statistics that about 6 to 12% of an average expense report is what we call non-compliant spend. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's fraudulent. It could mean someone's just broken policy, but fraud definitely makes up a component of that. So if you were to take your business and say we spend $1 million a year on T&E, and you were to take the lower end of that number being 6%, that's a significant amount of money that the business should not have paid. So they're probably the most common. The challenge that CFOs have is when you're being defrauded internally, because the person has intimate knowledge of your business, they're able to disguise their activity a lot better than some of the external frauds are. They're allowed to be a little bit more sophisticated. So it can be really hard actually to identify how to stop that. Like, to your question, what do you look for? There's unfortunately no one thing to look for. The one thing I would say is, and others, Cormac and both Mark have touched on this, process and policies in place are key to it. And then when you have a system that overlays those processes and policies, you have a enforced learning on your employees, where no one is responsible in the business for sort of hitting everyone with a stick and ensuring they're doing the right thing. The system does that for you based on the policies and the compliance that's built into it. But that you still, as a business leader, you still have to invest your time into the data, because the data is where you will find the anomalies, right? And to the earlier story that I gave, the reason he got caught for his little parking station scam was because he got greedy and decided that he could claim multiple receipts for the same time, and it got caught, right? So eventually people make a mistake, and if you've got access to data and that data is real time and you've got some analytics behind it, that's how you capture.
Yeah, and you know, I guess, you know, it can often start out as a mistake, and then the employee realizes the business hasn't picked up on it, and they begin to take advantage. You know, they've got opportunity and motive. You know, is there an extreme rort on top of the parking scam that you've given us that you could share?
Yeah, I mean, internal frauds, they can be extremely significant. You might have heard there was one that was quite well documented a few years, maybe 10 years ago, and very in the public eye, where essentially members of an accounts payable staff and members of leadership had defrauded a financial institution in Brisbane out of over, I think it was 1.2 or $2 million over 4 years, where essentially people who, again, know the process intimately are complicit together. And it can be as simple as they just agree to push things through. People who have approval thresholds agree to approve things, and no one likes to think of these things happening. Like, it's not fun to the conversation about culture. I work in the SMB space, and they can be very small businesses, but small businesses can grow exponentially. And as you grow, you increase your employees, and as you increase your employees, you change your culture. And a company of 5 people who bled for that company, wore many hats, who spend money like penny pinched for every dollar, now have 50 new employees who didn't go through what they went through, and their culture is very different. And that's when you start to see these scams pop up. But I could talk to you for probably an entire day, James, about the different rorts that we've seen globally, people expensing firearms and all sorts of things around our customers globally. And we've got a long list of very funny stories.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that you could certainly give us a few, but thanks for starting us on that topic. Cormac, you know, over to you. Have you experienced any examples of employee scams or rorts? And, you know, as a CFO, you know, what red flags and systems should we be putting in place?
Yeah, so there's the classic. So anyone who's got a work credit card, if you've gone out, you know, for some beers with the team, or you've gone out for lunch, and then you're the highest ranking person, and you go, oh, why don't you chuck that on your expense claim? Or why don't you pay for that, and I'll sign that off. It's a huge cultural thing, and if you decide to do that, you're actually signaling to the rest of the team that it's okay. And culturally, that's really terrible. So on the system side, what you're able to do is you're able to tag individuals with that particular expense, and you're able to look at who the highest ranking person is. So that gives you the ability to quite quickly use that data insights to go, hey, what's happening there? It allows you to do that management thing and actually drill down and make sure that it's not consistent. But then on the cultural side, it's all too easy to do. You know, you had a couple too many beers, or it was a bit bigger than you expected, and you really don't want to have that conversation. So it's just easier to let it slide. That's probably the one that happens all the time, that people don't even think about it as being fraud. That you just don't. But it's that cultural impact.
Would you recommend that that the control procedures are documented, and that every employee has access to these procedures and is trained on them as they start the business, and reiterated and refreshed?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. And businesses should have really good documented policies. I've been, as Andy was saying, I've been through companies where you haven't, and they've been really, really focused on small businesses that, you know, have to fight for every nickel and dime. So somebody writing a policy for a day is just not appropriate. And so for that, it really comes back to that cultural piece, and that's that piece I'll probably harp on. So another great example is with payroll. So expense claims in our organisation go through payroll. Don't happen everywhere. Sometimes they go through AP. As they go through payroll, I do the final review. So I do a deep dive on all of payroll, make sure I'm happy, including expense claims, and I sign that off. But what we've done is we've actually changed our culture within the company that once I've signed that piece of paper and I've said, yep, I'm good, we have almost a little internal audit. And so our head of people and culture at any particular time will be able to pick up that pay run and do a deep dive. And there's times there that you're just sitting there going, holy geez, did I actually review this enough? But what that does is that creates the culture that, to Andy's point about, you know, the big AP risks and things like that, that you don't know it's going to happen, but you know that it can be picked up. And that's enough for a lot of people to know that actually I'm going to stick to my knitting. I'm going to make sure that we carry on appropriately working through some of these activities, which is what we should be doing. And it's not this big, long, wielded activity. It's just enough that people know that we're going to pick things up. So it's one of the best things you can do with fraud. It doesn't matter what area it is. Make sure you cycle the staff through. Make sure there's ad hoc checks that you can just pick things up. Systems allow a lot of change in that area to happen and really dive down into anything that seems strange. But making sure your payroll person isn't your only payroll person and they're not doing payroll 24/7. Same with AP. Pull them out every now and then with no notice to do something else. And that helps with so many things, not just culturally, not just process and fraud, but that helps them know that they can go on leave, or, you know, if they happen to win lotto, you know, as an organisation that you can carry on.
Yeah, well, in Sydney, there's Australia, $80 million Powerball tonight. So who knows? Someone could be in that position.
I used to give the example of hit by a bus, and then people were like, "Oh, well, that's the best example to be using."
Yeah, that's it. I mean, just very quickly on that last point, you know, well, not the last point, but on that topic, do you have any tips on creating a counter fraud culture? You know, what simple steps should CFOs be doing in their orgs to create that culture that people can, or they know that, you know, the right from the wrong?
Yeah. So anyone who's looked at high performing culture, it always starts with trust. So you have to build trust. You cannot be in an environment where people do not trust each other. So that's really what you have to look at as key topic number one. Do people come to work? Do they enjoy work? Do they feel trusted? If they feel trusted, then they're willing to challenge you. And so you or any other finance leaders within the business have to feel comfortable being challenged. So it's those two parts. It's that trusted piece, but also that feeling of I can be challenged. And so my team know that they can challenge me on anything. And they also know that I will go straight to the chief exec or the board if needed to challenge either the board or the chief exec. And that's the kind of culture that you actually need to build up. You need to build up that culture of it's okay to ask, even when they ask and they know, even if they ask and it's valid expense, knowing that they can actually go through that process and you not feel concerned or go, hey, look, you know, you should know better. This is normal. This is good practice, or this is good process. Making sure that they can call those out is really, really critical. So there's a lot of self-reflection you need to do as an individual, but then you also need to think about your whole team and how you build that culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Andy, we're gonna move to external fraud, and it is a growing concern for finance teams. You know, phishing, false invoices, email compromise, just what Cormac has talked about, and those more sophisticated scams are catching CFOs off guard. What are the most common external threats facing CFOs?
Yeah, so I think someone touched on it earlier. It might have been Mark or Cormac. Forgive me, guys, I can't remember. But someone. So when we think of external fraud, as I said, it differs from internal a little bit in the sense that it's usually very high volume. It's a bit of a numbers game. And again, with the situation we're all in, all now being a decentralized workforce, you've got sort of even more pins to aim at. And you're just hoping you're going to find the weak link. So it's usually very high volume. It's usually always utilizing technology. Despite my love of technology, it can be used for nefarious as well. So I myself have experienced this, and I think most of us would have experienced either scam calls, scam text messages, phishing emails that come through. But what we've seen really successful over the last 18 months, and it's horrible to say it's been really successful, is a lot of businesses that we talk about fraud, and the response is we spend a lot of money on security. You know, we spend huge amounts of money on internet security. We spend huge amounts of money on this. We have the best data center. And it's all well and good, and that's wonderful. But the thing that they're not factoring in is that their points of failure aren't just their own organization anymore. Their partners, their ecosystem, their suppliers. So you might have remembered there was a AFR, I think it was AFR. It was one of the major Australian publications in the last 9 months about the small construction family-run business whose supplier, they weren't compromised, but their supplier was compromised. And email was intercepted through, we won't go into the technology of it, but as I think Cormac pointed out, it can be very sophisticated with how they expose vulnerabilities in the email. They exposed the vulnerability in the email of that small business's supplier. They changed the bank account details on what was a very legitimate invoice. It made it to that company. Everything looked perfectly right. The small business didn't challenge the change of the bank account information, and they paid a $50,000 invoice. That money's gone. And that is happening a lot, because as we embrace technology more, there are huge advantages that come from it. But unfortunately, as I said, it can be used for nefarious use as well. So we're seeing a lot of businesses who are struggling with fake invoices. And when I say fake invoices, the invoice itself is legitimate. Just the data on that invoice has been compromised. So that's probably the most common. And again, it's just a misconception that a lot of business leaders think that their business is the vulnerable one. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. You can be exposed by vulnerability in your partner network and your supplier network now.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a chain, and as they say, you're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain, and sometimes your chain extends well beyond your own business. Just stay with you, Andy. If anyone that audits expense or spend reports manually, they know how slow and error-prone the process can be. Can CFOs use automatic controls to catch the mistakes and fight against this potential fraud?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the real selling point of where technology kind of comes into its own. To the points Cormac were making, and I couldn't agree with him more, having the culture and the policies really well defined is absolutely key. But I would say there's a third layer to the policies and the culture, and that third layer is enforcing it with the technology and making it easy. Because when it's easy, you drive the right behaviors. If you ask your employees to do something, if you're the CFO and you ask your employees to worry about fringe benefit tax and financial related information and capture all this information manually, then they pass it through a manual process to be audited manually. You're just allowing the first person in that chain to have a really tough time, because they might not even understand what you're asking them to do. So they will have the best intentions, but they may get it wrong. Then you're asking that to be passed across to your finance team to then audit. And that's where that labor intensity comes in, right? They've got to sit there, they've got to audit. The more things they audit, the more chance of them making a human mistake. Whereas what technology will do is just give you a very binary yes or no. Did you comply with policy? Yes or no. And that will be flagged. So it means that you can have things like duplicate invoices that the system itself will pick up straight away. It'll look into the database, it'll identify it's seen this invoice before, and it will flag it straight away to you. This is a duplicate invoice. And businesses do get a lot of duplicate invoices, and they're not always nefarious. Sometimes it's just that it's sat on someone's desk for so long that the supplier is desperate for payment and decides, you know what, I'm just going to spam an AP team with this invoice and hope I get it paid. And multiple invoices, unfortunately, inadvertently get paid. So to your point, and you articulated perfectly, where technology really sings is in helping businesses capture that. They will capture and they will enforce that policy, and they'll provide a good experience to both the user and the finance team. And probably even more importantly is you also get to remove that labor of audit from a finance team, which is potentially just very data entry heavy labor, and you provide them the opportunity to provide real insight back to the business on things that could drive savings and efficiencies. So that person then becomes an opportunity for cost mitigation and reduction, rather than somebody who's really just potentially doing a lot of data intensive, either entry or auditing.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cormac, I mean, we love automation here on CFO Lunchtime Live, and I know you do too. What parts of the finance function would you focus on from an automation perspective to help finance teams with fraud and the wider processes?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've just had a look over and I can see there's about 180 people attending. So I could easily focus on one section and people would go, oh, that's just not relevant to me. So I've got a different take home for that question. So for me, technology enables us not to have boring jobs. That's a real key factor to it. So anything that's monotonous or boring can be removed from a business. So the really easy take home is sit down with your teams, finance and the wider business, and just go, what's boring? What bores the crap out of you? So if it's processing invoice, you can do an OCR. If it's something that you need robotic learning for or machine learning because it's a repetitive task, then hey, look, there's technologies out there for that too. So all of these, if people tell you, look, I spend 8 hours a day doing this and it is boring as hell, it's monotonous, it's just continual, then in the back of your head, if you're not going, wow, I can get a really good ROI on that because surely we don't need that. We can either repoint the person or to a value-added activity, or we can look at how we structure the teams in the future, or a whole lot of other things. Then you really need to question yourself. I mean, there's people spend ages doing these days. All of the technologies, OCR, robotics, machine learning. That's sort of past history almost. Now you're seeing accountants focus more and more on how do you get the information out. We're data rich. How do you pull this information out? So you can see people diving into Excel sheet after Excel sheet to try and get information when you can pick up a BI platform for cheapest chips these days, and you can build out something that's fully automated. And so it goes right from startup land, which can be really cheap, to something fully integrated, which allows you complete power of your data on the way through. So again, taking that right back to the start, there's heaps in there to unpick. I'm sure that's a whole topic by itself. But for me, that's really sitting down with the team and going, what do you find boring? How do we remove that? And then what do we repoint you into the business? Because I can guarantee you, everyone out there is going, I would love to have more resource. With labour conditions how they are right now, love to have more resource. Easy way to get that injection into the business quickly is to look at automation or system process controls.
Yeah, absolutely. In one of my lectures to uni students, I talk about the future of technology in the industry, and I'd say that technology takes care of the boring stuff. And a phrase that I coined when I was working at Xero was "let technology do the heavy lifting." So it's certainly the same themes are continuing to go along, and at a fraud level, obviously, the more automation can assist in that process, but not eliminate. Now, Mark, a question for you. You've been sitting there patiently waiting for a question on a topic that you are very knowledgeable at. Just as technology is assisting CFOs, it's also helping the fraudsters. Criminals and scammers are usually that one step ahead. What do you see as being the future of fraud, and how scary is it going to get?
Well, I have some very bad news for you, James and Andy and Cormac. We've all probably heard of deep fakes at this point, all right? So a deep fake is a piece of artificial intelligence software that allows you to feed a sample of a real person. We're going to start off with the example of a sample of someone's voice and someone's cadence. And when you fed sufficient amount of that voice and cadence into the artificial intelligence, you can basically just type, I want it to say, and it will say it in that person's voice. And Cormac, to your point, because the fraudster didn't know that you had a Kiwi accent, that immediately caught them. I can tell you that all four of us have already spoken enough during this event to be able to train an AI system to deepfake any of our voices. So there's that. And there's already a few documented examples. There's still just a few, but there are a few documented examples of CEOs having their voices deep faked and getting funds transferred. And this calls for that kind of second degree, that two-factor authentication. Yes, this person sounds real, but how do I know they're real? They're just screaming at me over a phone in that command voice. What else do we need? So all organizations immediately need to think about what that second or third channel is, because that is now easily doable. The next step after that, and you've probably all seen the Tom Cruise video and maybe the Barack Obama video, maybe even the Queen Elizabeth dancing video. These are all the next generation of deep fakes where you feed a lot of video content in. And gentlemen, we've been on the same video call for the last 45 minutes, so they now have that. So theoretically, with enough computing power, and again, you can rent that computing power from Amazon, you could generate a deep fake that could video call someone and in real time tell them to move the money. So this is not theoretical anymore. This is just where scammers, if they are interested and intent enough to get into your organization, if they feel that that kind of social hack will work, they will put the resources behind that to get that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely scary, and thanks for scaring us as you usually do. Distributed identities. You know, it's a topic that I've heard you talk about before. You know, is that going to be the way forward? Are we going to be verified through like a blockchain of some description?
So in a lot of ways, we already have a kind of version of distributed identity. If you go to the bank and try to open an account, they're going to want that, quote, 100 points of ID, right? So they're going to want the something with your postal address on it. They may want your passport. In other words, they want multiple points of reference that they can triangulate so that they can ascertain with some high degree of veracity that you are who you say they are. That is moving now into distributed systems. And probably by the end of this decade, you'll have a number of authoritative resources. In our case, probably Service New South Wales, probably our bank account, probably the post office. All of these will be providing some form of service that can be queried or that we can rely upon, so that when we have to give our ID, what we're doing is we're providing what we would call a federated version of ID, where that ID is derived from how much we can trust all of these different sources. Now, there's a gotcha here in that, in particular, institutions, organizations, and government like to have a single point of identification. The government wanted to do a single point of identification for Australians, and ASIO and the ASD said no, because it's a single point of failure. You just hack into that system, and then you have control of all of the identities. So accept no substitutes. And if you're going for an identity solution, make sure that it has as much resilience, which means it has as much distribution as possible, because those systems are inherently more stable. They're harder to build, they take longer to build, but in the long term, that's where we're going when it comes to identity. And so when I call you, James, you will be able to check my identity in real time, and you'll be able to know that, no, it's a scam caller from Russia.
Absolutely. Well, that is good to know. And you say the end of the decade, and 9 years is going to go past pretty quick, particularly if we're locked at home. Well, actually, it might go a bit slower. Now, Andy, I imagine as CFOs are considering implementing new tech such as Concur, I mean, one of the things top of mind would be to ensure minimal business disruption when there's lots of things going on. You know, for CFOs today thinking of a spend or invoice management solution, what are the key considerations they need to look at, and how easy is it to get something like that implemented?
Yeah, look, the most important consideration would be their availability of resources, right? The availability of people that they have right now that they could dedicate to a project. How the most important consideration really too is that they actually spend some time before they even start a project thinking about the process that they currently have. One of the mistakes a lot of businesses make is they say, great, we've got this process, let's automate it. And I understand why they do that. It's sort of the simplest path from A to B, but the problem is what you end up doing in a lot of circumstances is just automate bad process, because in a manual process, you will have typically found that it has become that behemoth of a process because you have been forced into certain decisions. So as your business has grown, you've gone, we've gotten too big, we need to do something about this. What do? Stick another manual step in. And a lot of businesses go, this is amazing, let's embrace technology, let's automate. And then they go, let's automate this, boom, and sort of drop it. I would strenuously advise against that. A very small amount of effort put in up front to re-engineer that process. And again, I know I've harped on this a little bit, but my advice would be to sit there, and I think Cormac, you touched on this around putting sort of culture and employees first. Sit there and think about what's boring. I think that's how it was articulated in that process. Strip back all the unnecessary parts and start from the bare bones. Build out a process from that bare bones, start implementing that, and then add the parts in for the checks and balances that you think you really need in order to facilitate what you're trying to achieve. That would be my advice. And to be honest, that's probably the most labor-intensive part of it, is you as a business just getting in a room together and saying, let's tear this apart over a few days, and then work out what the bare bones is, and let's start there. And take advice from technology companies who do it day in and day out would be my advice as well, because they can tell you about the thousands of other customers that went down the route they were going, and why you shouldn't go down that route. Once you've done that, if you've put a bit of effort into doing that, rolling out a project is extremely straightforward. You're talking a few weeks, right? That really is the labor-intensive part. Typically what happens is businesses get into a project and then start to try to automate that bad practice and then go to the, oh, we should re-engineer this. And that's just, in my opinion, highly inefficient.
Yeah, absolutely. That I've seen that happen many times before. Now we're sort of, I'm going to move into to closing questions, because we need to allow Mark his 10 minutes to guide us on where we're at and where we're going. But you know, and as I suspected, we were going to have plenty of things to talk about today. But Cormac, you know, you just heard what Andy said, and you implemented Concur whilst you were in lockdown. How was that? How did you manage to make a change like that during a period when people were distributed and we were, you know, all working from home? What were some of the key lessons you've learned while going through that?
Yeah, so just to carry on through what Andy was saying. So first of all, we'd been in a process where we'd rolled out a few systems in a go, and actually rolling out systems is really straightforward. You know, anyone can tell you this is how you manage a project, this is what it means, this is what you do. The change management piece is absolutely critical. The people piece is absolutely critical. So when we rolled out SAP, for example, we'd gone from 50 systems down to 1. We managed to do that quick, smart, and we did that by hands up. We said, we are not the experts. We want to take it out of the box. We want to take this as a wave 1, as a first instance, as an MPV, and we will revisit this in a year's time, and we'll do all the fancy stuff then. We'll just pull that out of the box. So we did the same with Concur. We said, hey, look, what we're going to do is pull that straight out of the box, plug it straight in. And we actually had the added benefit. Anyone who's done system changeover and knows that you need to do parallel runs and you need to make sure this matches and that matches. If you were in New Zealand in a hospitality business in level 4, you'd realise we had 0 revenue, which makes it the absolute prime time to roll in an OCR. So we essentially we went down and then used the OCR to come back up the other side. So it was a really good process. Team were used to the state of we're going to rely on experts to tell us what they think we should do, because we'd scaled the business so fast. Actually, we weren't best placed to say we're going to use this process. We were best placed to absorb the information and say, yes, that best practice will work with us. And that's the sort of approach we had. If that best practice won't work, can we change first? And then if we can't change, why can't we change? Because no business in the world is that unique. They're just not.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I've got a final question for each of you, rapid fire questions, and I would expect rapid fire answers. Mark, you know, we're rapidly approaching 2022. What are the top 3 tech trends that CFOs need to have on their radars?
All right, first one, digital currency. We know it's coming. It's going to be coming from the Fed and probably other places. The Jackson Hole meeting of all the directors of the central banks is happening in about a week. More will come out of that. All right, Second, sustainability. The IPCC report dropped this week. And so people will take a look at their spend in terms of, is their technology spend contributing to sustainability, or is it contributing to shorten the life of the planet? Finally, the privacy tug of war. All of us are using lots of tools that we bought from someone else that have data trails that are going off into, well, who knows where, such as what Cormac was reporting about his Chrome browser. And that tug of war is really going to start to heat up as well.
Thank you, Mark. Andy, you're working at the forefront of tech and perhaps even some of the innovations that we get to see. You've seen them well before us. What are your predictions on the next big game changers for CFOs?
Yeah, and it's strictly my personal opinion. I think Mark and I might be kindred spirits on this. I actually definitely agree. It's the digital currency space. I would articulate it as the digital asset environment, and specifically, there's a component of that called smart contracts, which is essentially a technological way of being able to build a contract, build the parameters, forgive me, of a contract in code, and then have two parties interact with each other for any form of settlement without a third-party intermediary needing to enforce that contract. The system itself enforces the parameters. If someone breaches it, then it reverts to a state. I won't go down the rabbit hole on it, but it provides some pretty incredible and exciting real-world use cases that are actually already being used today in a very small set, but are being used today.
Yeah, absolutely. Pre-lockdowns and breakfast, CFO breakfast, I have heard Mark talk about smart contracts on a few presentations, so I would tend to agree. And Cormac, last question before we let Mark take the stage. It's a favorite question for panelists on the Future of Finance series. Will smart machines replace smart CFOs?
Oh, interesting. So it comes back to what CFOs and finance people do. We're storytellers and we're challengers, and that's all we are. So if you think back to when cars overtook horses, and now we've got EV vehicles, and people think about, yes, you need to transport people. Well, no, you don't, because Zoom's overtaken all of that. So we don't actually need cars to transport people anymore because we can do things like this. So will we still need storytellers and challengers in the business? Yeah, we will.
Fantastic. Well, that is a great way to finish off on this part of today's webinar. Andy and Cormac, we're going to bid you farewell, but thank you very much for your time today. And certainly, if anybody wants to talk about SAP Concur, they can get in touch with Andy. So guys, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
All right, Mark, now at 11 a.m, I listen for the New South Wales Daily Number, and then I'm straight onto Twitter to get your unbiased breakdown of the numbers and the real story that they are telling us in regards to the pandemic. So it's over to you to get your take on where we are at and where we are going. And whilst it is just a short 10-minute wrap, I am sure I will, as usual, come away with more questions than answers. So it's over to you, mate. Take the floor.
All right. Thank you, James. So I'm going to break this down into what we call the Johari window. Many of you may be familiar with this from Donald Rumsfeld. It's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown knowns. So we're going to start with the known knowns. Gallup, which is the big American survey firm, published a big poll in late July, so about 3 weeks ago, where they took a look at what was going on in American offices, because we see people rapidly changing jobs in the post-pandemic period in America. And what they saw was that, in fact, there have never been higher levels of disengagement in the office as there is today. And this is one reason why people are just leaving in droves, because there's a sense, and this doesn't really seem to be just because people are not in the office, although I think that's clearly a contributor to it. But it feels like there's just a disconnect at the level of the office between managers and their employees, and that people are drifting away from the situations where they don't feel connected. And so this is a big red flashing alarm to all of us that, in fact, managers now need to start to rethink how they manage in a post-lockdown, post-COVID era. Because, in fact, the kind of management people are looking for is closer. the more that we go to hybrid working and working from home and working from anywhere, the greater the need for that continuous connection, that continuous checking in, that continuous negotiation around role and responsibility and time spent and work-life balance. All of that stuff really wasn't even on the table before the pandemic because we were just business as usual. This is the way things had always worked for 100 years. Now all of that is being thrown into question. And so what you see is you see disengagement increasing with employees and organizations that haven't had their penny drop moment around this. And this means that there's really going to be two kinds of organizations heading out of the pandemic everywhere in the world. The organizations that got the memo and the organizations that didn't. And the organizations that didn't are going to bleed their best and their brightest because those are the people who will feel the disengagement first. And that means that there's an enormous opportunity for organizations that did get the memo, that understand that the future favors the flexible, to be able to get this incredible harvest of talented people who will be coming onto the market globally, not just in America, not just in Europe, but clearly early next year, probably February, as we really head out of the pandemic here in Australia, there is going to be a huge sorting hat of people going to different businesses, which will really be seeing how they are and how they want to work in the post-pandemic environment. All right, so that's the known known. Then there's the known unknown. So last week, the AFR published something that we all kind of sensed in our bones, which is that the real estate, commercial real estate, office real estate environment is now completely different than it was 18 months ago. There's at least 1/4 of all commercial real estate in CBDs is lying fallow right now. Given that Sydney is probably going to be in some form of lockdown till at least the end of November, that number is going to increase. This means two different things. It means that employers need to look at their use of property differently. The reasons for people to come into the office are to connect, to build teams, to actually collaborate in a space together for a period of time, and then they go back out into the world. So the way we're using office space is different. Our needs are different. And so every business now needs to take a look at how they're using their space and how they need to reinvest in how their space is being used. But they also need to know that there's now probably going to be a buyer's market for real estate. So it's time to start to think about renegotiating your leases on a long-term basis, because there are going to be a lot of property owners who are feeling really pinched and will be feeling really pinched for a period of time as we exit the pandemic, because the way we use our CBDs has permanently changed. So that's the known unknown. We don't know the exact shape of that landscape, but we absolutely know that we will be entering that landscape, and so it is important to prepare for it. And finally, there is the unknown known. The unknown known is the thing that we don't want to look at, but that we know is absolutely present. So just over the course of this conversation with all of us, the ACT went into lockdown. The ACT will be in lockdown for a week because they found their first Delta case. So all of a sudden, the landscape now across the country is changing continuously. We know that Delta is different. I'm in Sydney. I've been in lockdown for 7 weeks. I'll probably be in lockdown for 10 or 12 more weeks. We know that Delta is different. What we are starting to understand is just how different Delta is. This is where we need to look at what's going on in the United States and in the UK, which are sort of at the forefront of both combating the pandemic, but understanding the way that Delta is changing our expectations for how the pandemic works. Everything we understood about how COVID worked last year has to be rewritten now. We need to think differently about this. And the opportunity for us here is that we can learn from what's going on in the US and the UK as they deal with Delta before we start to open up again. So we have a chance now to adapt our own processes. We have a chance to learn from their experiences. And that's a key thing. If we do that, then we can have an easier transition to a post-pandemic world.
Mark, even in that short space of time, and I really do love the known knowns, the known unknowns, and what was the unknown knowns? I thoroughly enjoy those. But again, you've blown us away with your analysis, as we do. So thank you so much for your time. You didn't need your screen, mate. It was very, very clear exactly what you needed to get across. And everybody, that does bring us to the end of the webcast. Now, a link to the session will be emailed to you all within 24 hours, and I encourage you to rewatch it, as the topics that covered today are going to grow in importance as the world continues to rely more and more on technology. Thank you to Richard and the CFO series for inviting me to be MC for the Lunchtime Live today. I surely hope everyone's enjoyed the discussion as much as I have. Thank you to our partner for the CFO Lunchtime Live, SAP, and thank you to our panelists, Andy, Cormac, and Mark. It was a great discussion, and we certainly appreciate them making the time to come online. And lastly, thank you to you, all of our attendees, once again for joining us over lunch, and we look forward to seeing you at the next CFO Series event, either online or face-to-face sometime again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.